The forest held its breath that night, the way it always does before something changes forever. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over old woods after midnight. Not the absence of sound, but a held stillness, as though every tree and root and shadow is waiting to see what will happen next. Mara had walked through that silence 100 times in daylight, gathering herbs for the inn's kitchen, cutting through the trees on her way to the river. But she had never once walked through it in the dark, and she told herself, with every step, that she would turn back the moment she reached the old stone marker at the edge of the path. She did not turn back. Her lantern swung small circles of gold light across the frost-covered ground, catching on fallen leaves, on the pale undersides of branches, on her own breath curling white in the cold air. Every person in Blackridge knew the stories about these woods. The wolves that came down from the northern mountains when the moon grew full and hungry. The travelers who wandered in during autumn and were never seen again. The whispers passed from grandmother to grandchild that something ancient still moved among these trees, something older than the village, older than the roads that led to it. Mara had grown up hearing those stories at her mother's knee, half believing them the way children believe in monsters under the bed. Real enough to make her walk faster past the tree line at dusk, but not real enough to keep her from wandering in now, alone, toward a sound she could not explain and could not ignore. She stopped beneath an ancient oak, its roots thick and twisted, rising from the earth like the knuckles of some sleeping giant who had lain down centuries ago and simply never woken. She held her breath and listened. Nothing. Only wind moving through black branches. Only the distant call of some night bird settling deeper into its hollow. Then it came again, a low, broken groan, the sound of a man trying, with everything he had left, not to make a sound at all. Mara's stomach tightened. This was not the cry of an animal caught in a trap. This was not the wind playing tricks on a tired mind. This was pain, deliberate and human, forced through gritted teeth by someone who did not want to be found and yet could not stop himself from making noise. She should have turned around. She told herself this even as she took another step forward. Every sensible woman in Blackridge knew better than to walk toward danger in the dark, especially during the last week of autumn, when the moon hung full and heavy overhead, and the wolves grew bold enough to venture close to the village fences. But Mara had never, in 29 years, been particularly good at walking away from someone who needed help. It was, her mother used to say, both her greatest gift and her most dangerous flaw. "Hello," she called softly. No answer. She stepped between two pine trees, their needles brushing cold against her sleeves, and the smell reached her before anything else did. Copper, salt, blood, unmistakable and thick in the night air. Mara froze. Then she saw him. A man lay sprawled at the base of the enormous oak, half swallowed by drifts of fallen leaves, one hand pressed hard against his side where his black coat had been torn wide open. Blood had soaked through his fingers and pooled dark in the dirt beneath him, more blood than Mara had ever seen come from a single wound, more than she thought a body could lose and still be breathing. He was enormous, even collapsed and bleeding. There was something about the width of his shoulders, the stillness in the way he held himself despite the pain, that suggested a man who had been born to command a room rather than beg for help inside one. Dark hair clung damp to his forehead. A deep cut ran along one cheekbone, still weeping thin lines of red. And his eyes, when they finally opened and found her, his eyes were gold. Not brown, not hazel, not some trick of lantern light against dark irises. Gold, unmistakably, the way a coin gleams when it catches sun. It was never meant to see underground. "Go," he rasped. Mara blinked, rooted to the spot. "Excuse me. Run. You appear to be bleeding," she said, because it was the only thing her mind could produce. I know. Then you need help. I said run. She looked around at the silent trees, at the empty dark stretching in every direction, and something in her, the part of her that had spent a lifetime being overlooked, being the last one anyone thought to check on, refused to simply turn and leave a dying man behind because he had told her to. You know, she whispered, kneeling slowly beside him, most dying men say thank you when someone finds them. His expression barely shifted, though something like exhaustion passed behind his eyes. I'm not dying. Mara glanced pointedly at the blood soaking through his shirt, spreading wider even as she watched. You could have fooled me. Something almost like amusement flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Then his eyes slid shut. Sir, Mara's voice cracked with sudden panic. She touched his shoulder, and his hand shot up and caught her wrist with a strength that startled a gasp out of her. His eyes opened again, and for one terrifying second, she was certain he meant to hurt her. Instead, his grip loosened, and his voice dropped to something barely above a breath. Don't let them find me. Then he was gone again, his hands slipping from her wrist, his body going still in a way that made her chest seize with fear. Somewhere beyond the trees, a branch snapped. Mara's head whipped toward the sound. Another crack, closer this time. Then another, and another, a rhythm of footsteps moving with purpose through the undergrowth. Someone was coming, and in that instant, Mara finally understood exactly why the stranger had told her to run, and exactly why she was not going to. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd genuinely love to hear from you. And if this is your first time here, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. She had only seconds to decide. She could leave the wounded stranger where he lay, slip back through the trees, and be safely inside her own bed before whoever was searching ever knew she had been there at all. Or she could grab this bleeding, unconscious man, a man twice her size, a man whose eyes glowed gold in the dark, a man who had begged her with his last conscious breath not to let anyone find him, and risk everything to save a life that had nothing to offer her in return. Mara chose the man. She would spend the rest of her life both grateful and terrified that she had. She grabbed him beneath the arms and pulled, her boots slipping against wet roots and half-frozen mud, her arms burning with effort within seconds. He was heavier than any man had a right to be, dead weight dragging against the forest floor, and every few feet she had to stop and catch her breath while the voices behind her grew steadily louder. You're going to help me whether you like it or not, she muttered through gritted teeth, hauling him another few feet toward the cover of a fallen pine. Search every tree. A voice called out behind them, sharp and commanding. Mara's heart stopped cold in her chest. He's injured, another voice answered closer now. He couldn't have gone far. She pulled the stranger behind the fallen trunk with one final, desperate heave, then dropped down beside him and dragged broken branches and loose leaves over both of them with shaking hands, working as quietly and quickly as her trembling fingers allowed. She pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck, searching for a pulse she was terrified she wouldn't find. There, weak, thready, but steady. Please don't die, she whispered, so quietly it was barely more than breath. His eyes opened, just a sliver, gold catching the last thin light of the moon through the branches above them. And then something happened that Mara would spend months trying and failing to explain, even to herself. His breathing calmed, slowed, steadied, as though her voice alone had reached some part of him that no bandage, no medicine, no prayer could have touched. She didn't understand it. She wouldn't understand it for a long time yet. But the voices were drawing closer, moving methodically through the trees, and the man beside her was still losing blood with every passing minute. There was no more time to wonder, no more time to weigh the danger against the cost. So Mara made the single most dangerous decision of her entire life. She took him home. Mara had spent most of her life being the kind of woman people noticed only when they wanted something from her. At 29, she had already spent more than a decade running the Blackridge Inn nearly single-handedly. Awake before the sun to light the ovens and start the bread, still pouring drinks, and wiping down tables long after the last traveler had stumbled off to bed. She carried firewood in the winter until her shoulders ached. She cleaned rooms that guests left in worse states than they'd found them. She listened, night after night, to strangers complain about the weather, about the roads, about their aching feet and their disappointing children and their unfaithful spouses. And in all that listening, Mara had learned things. She knew which travelers liked their coffee strong enough to strip the varnish off a table, and which ones swore they wanted it strong but really meant weak and sweet. She knew which regulars watered down their own wine glasses when they thought no one was watching, and which ones never once left a coin behind no matter how many free meals she'd quietly slip them on hard weeks. Lonely people, she had discovered, talked more than they ever intended to. And over the years, without ever meaning to become one, Mara had become something like the keeper of half the secrets in Blackridge. But there was one secret she had never expected to be keeping. A wounded, golden-eyed stranger, bleeding out on the floor of her own bedroom, hidden from whoever was hunting him with murder clearly in mind. She managed to drag him through the back entrance of the inn just as the first gray light of dawn began creeping over the tree line, bolted the door behind them with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the woods, and slid down against it until she was sitting on the cold floor, chest heaving. "I'm never doing that again," she told the unconscious man sprawled across her floorboards, though even as the words left her mouth, some small and unfamiliar part of her suspected she was lying to herself. She crawled over and pressed her palm to his forehead, burning, far hotter than any fever she'd ever nursed a traveler through. "Wonderful," she muttered, and forced herself back to her feet. She ran for clean towels, for a basin of water from the kitchen pump, for the small, worn medical box her mother had left behind years before, the same weathered wooden box that had taught her nearly everything she knew about tending wounds. Her mother had been the closest thing Blackridge had to a healer, spending her days among herbs and bandages and the quiet, practical business of keeping people alive. She had taught Mara two things above all else, and both of them came rushing back now as Mara knelt beside the stranger with trembling hands. The first, panic never once stopped bleeding. The second, people were always far more fragile than they appeared, even the ones who looked as though they'd been carved from stone. Mara steadied her breathing, forced her hands to stop shaking, and got to work. She cut away the ruined, blood-soaked fabric at his side with the small knife from the medical box, and what lay beneath made her breath catch despite every wound she had tended in her years running the inn. A blade, a narrow, deliberate wound, had sliced deep into his flesh, and along the edges of the cut, something caught the lantern light with a faint, unnatural shimmer. Silver. Mara recognized it instantly, and her stomach turned cold. Her mother had warned her about silver more than once over the years, not because she put any real stock in the old fireside tales about wolves and curses that the village elders loved to tell around the hearth, but because certain wounds, for reasons her mother never fully explained, reacted to silver in ways ordinary wounds simply did not. They festered differently. They resisted healing in ways that defied every remedy she knew. Mara cleaned the wound as carefully as her shaking hands allowed, and the stranger suddenly groaned beneath her, his whole body flinching. "Stay still," she said, more firmly than she felt. His eyes opened, gold again, unmistakable, staring up at her through the dim lantern light. Mara stared back, unable to look away. "Your eyes," He turned his face aside. Don't. Don't what? Ask questions. She raised an eyebrow despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. You broke into my room, bleeding all over my floor. And you expect me not to ask questions? I didn't break in. You were carried in. By you, he pointed out. And there was something almost dry in the observation, something that suggested a sense of humor buried somewhere beneath all that blood and pain. Exactly my point, Mara said. His mouth tightened, though whether from pain or from suppressing another almost smile, she couldn't tell. He tried to push himself upright, and she planted a hand flat against his chest and shoved him back down without hesitation. Absolutely not. I have to leave. No. His eyes narrowed, as though the word itself was foreign to him, as though very few people in his life had ever dared to simply refuse him. No. No, she repeated, holding his gaze without flinching. You don't know who I am. I know exactly who you are, Mara said, wringing out a cloth in the basin of water. You're the single most demanding patient I have ever had the misfortune of treating, and you can't even stand up on your own. For the briefest instant, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough that she noticed, close enough that some part of her filed it away as a small, private victory. Then the sound of horses reached them through the shuttered window, and everything about him changed in an instant. The softness vanished entirely, replaced by something sharp and alert and entirely unfamiliar. How many men work here? He demanded, suddenly all business. Mara blinked. What? How many? 3. How many doors does this building have? 2. Windows? 5, I think. Maybe 6. Can you lock them all? Yes. Do it. Now. Mara scrambled to her feet without arguing. Something in his voice pulling immediate obedience out of her before her mind had even fully caught up. She moved through the inn, locking every window she could find, her heart hammering harder with each latch she threw. When she returned to the room, he was watching her from where he sat propped against the wall, his golden eyes tracking her every movement. What? She asked. You should be afraid of me, he said quietly. I am. You don't look it. I'm too tired to look like anything else right now, she admitted, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth again. Then the hoofbeats outside stopped entirely, and whatever fragile warmth had been building between them vanished as quickly as it had come. A man's voice called out from beyond the front door, sharp and commanding. Open the door. Mara looked toward the stranger, and he whispered, urgent and low, Whatever happens, don't tell them I'm here. She nodded once, and made her way downstairs to face whatever waited for her, leaving him alone with his wound and his secrets. 3 riders sat waiting outside the inn, their horses breathing steam into the cold morning air. Mara recognized the man at the front immediately. Captain Dorian, a regular enough presence at the inn over the years that she'd serve him more meals than she could count, always polite, always generous with his coin, never once giving her reason to distrust him until this exact moment. He smiled the instant she opened the door, and something about the smile didn't reach his eyes the way it always had before. Mara, Captain, we're searching for a man, Dorian said, his tone deceptively casual. One who may pass through this area. Injured, possibly dangerous. Plenty of men pass through Blackridge, Captain. You'll have to be more specific. This one carries royal significance, Dorian said, and something in his voice made the words feel heavier than they should have. His gaze drifted past her shoulder toward the stairs. May we come inside and take a look around? Mara stepped fully into the doorway, blocking his view as best she could. The inn is closed at this hour. It's 6 a.m. Exactly my point, Captain. His smile thinned into something colder. We carry royal authority to search any property in the village, Mara. You understand that? Then I'll need to see the writ, she said evenly, refusing to move. His jaw tightened visibly, and behind him, one of the other soldiers murmured something too quiet for Mara to catch. Dorian's eyes flicked upward toward the second floor of the inn, and Mara shifted her stance just enough to interrupt his line of sight without making the movement look deliberate. "What exactly happened to this man you're searching for?" she asked, buying every second she could. "The Alpha King was attacked in these very woods last night," Dorian said, watching her face carefully as he spoke. "His body has not yet been recovered." Mara felt every drop of blood drain from her face, though she forced her expression to remain still, forced her voice to stay level. "I haven't seen anyone unusual." "Are you certain of that?" "Yes." Dorian studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, the way she imagined he studied prisoners before an interrogation. Mara had spent enough years reading the faces of travelers and drunks and liars passing through her inn to recognize exactly what kind of look this was. He wasn't searching for a missing man out of concern for his safety. He was hunting someone he fully intended to kill, and he wanted to know if she was standing between him and his prey. "Search the inn," he ordered finally, and there was nothing left for Mara to do but step aside and let his men through. She followed close behind Dorian as he climbed the stairs himself, her pulse pounding so loudly in her own ears she was certain he must be able to hear it. At the top of the staircase, he stopped abruptly, his head tilting slightly. "What is that smell?" Mara's stomach dropped. Blood, the unmistakable copper scent of it, still clinging faintly to the hallway despite every window she'd cracked open the night before to air it out. Dorian moved toward her bedroom door with sudden purpose. Mara stepped in front of it before he could reach the handle. "You can't go in there." "And why is that?" "Because it's my private room, Captain, and I'd appreciate some privacy in my own home." He reached past her anyway and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed sat perfectly made, untouched. The window remained shut and latched exactly as she'd left it. No blood stained the floor. No wounded stranger lay hidden anywhere in sight. In the frantic moments before Dorian's arrival, Mara had somehow managed to half-drag, half-carry the barely conscious stranger into a narrow, forgotten storage space hidden behind the chimney wall. A space so old and so easily overlooked that even Mara herself sometimes forgot it existed until desperation reminded her. Dorian scanned the tidy room slowly, methodically, before his eyes finally settled back on Mara with open suspicion. "You know something?" he said. "No, you are lying to me." "I'm a waitress, Captain, not a spy for the crown," Mara said, meeting his gaze without blinking, drawing on every ounce of composure she'd learned over years of dealing with difficult, demanding guests. He stepped closer, close enough that she caught the scent of leather and horse sweat clinging to his uniform. "If you see this man, if you hear anything at all about his whereabouts, you will report it to the crown immediately. Do you understand me?" "Of course, Captain," Mara said, forcing something that might have passed for sincerity into her voice. Dorian held her gaze a moment longer, then finally turned and left, his men filing out behind him. Mara stood frozen at the top of the stairs until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely into the distance, and only then did she allow herself to sink against the wall and breathe, her whole body trembling with the release of fear she'd been forcing down for the better part of an hour. Then she ran back upstairs and pulled open the hidden panel behind the chimney. The stranger sat huddled inside the cramped space, his knees drawn up, his breathing shallow but steady, his golden eyes finding hers the moment the panel swung open. "How did you even fit in there?" Mara demanded, staring at the impossibly narrow space he'd folded his large frame into. "I told you," he said quietly, wincing as he shifted. I'm not a common traveler. That much is becoming increasingly obvious. He slowly, painfully pushed himself upright, one hand braced against the wall. Now perhaps you understand why I told you to run. I understand that you were hiding in my chimney while a royal captain interrogated me in my own home. Who are you? She pressed when he said nothing further. He hesitated so long that Mara genuinely thought he might refuse to answer at all. Then, finally, quietly, Lucian. Lucian what? Lucien Valle. She waited, expecting some further explanation, some title or context that would make the name carry the weight it seemed to want to carry. Nothing came. She crossed her arms. Am I supposed to recognize that name? For the first time since she'd found him bleeding beneath the ancient oak, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories looked genuinely, entirely surprised. No, he admitted. Mara let out a short laugh despite everything. Good. I was worried for a moment you'd turn out to be one of those insufferable, self-important nobles everyone in this village never stops complaining about. He laughed, a real laugh this time, short and startled out of him, immediately followed by a sharp wince as pain lanced through his side. Mara rushed forward to steady him. You're bleeding again. I'm aware. Sit down. Now. I don't take orders from anyone. You do today, she said firmly, and to her genuine surprise, he sat. She cleaned the wound again in silence, her hands steady now despite everything, and that was when they both noticed it happening. The moment her fingers made contact with the skin, the torn flesh beneath her cloth began, almost imperceptibly, to knit itself back together. Mara went utterly still, staring. Lucian's expression shuddered instantly, closing off whatever had been building between the moments before. Don't say anything about it. I wasn't planning to, Mara said quietly, though her mind was already racing with questions she didn't dare voice aloud. What kind of man healed like that, right in front of her eyes? And why, every single time she was the one touching him, did his body seem to calm, to strengthen, in a way that felt like more than simple coincidence? 3 days passed before either of them found the courage to ask the questions that hung unspoken between them. Lucian remained hidden behind the chimney wall throughout the daylight hours, emerging only after dark when the inn's few remaining guests had long since retired to their rooms. Mara told every curious traveler who asked that the wounded stranger from a few nights back had already recovered and moved on, and to her own quiet astonishment, she found the lie came easier each time she told it, as though some part of her had already decided that protecting him mattered more than the risk of being caught in the deception. His wound healed at a pace that defied everything Mara's mother had ever taught her about the human body. What should have taken weeks took days. His strength returned in visible increments, his color coming back, his movements growing steadier and more sure with each passing evening. And somewhere in the quiet hours of those 3 days, spent huddled together over cups of tea and the low crackle of a carefully banked fire, the careful distance between them began, slowly and without either of them quite noticing, to disappear. They talked, not about the attack that had nearly killed him, not about the crown he still refused to discuss in any real detail, not about the men who continued to search the surrounding villages for any sign of him. Instead, they talked about ordinary things, the kind of small, unremarkable conversations that Mara realized with something like surprise she had been starving for her entire adult life. She told him about her mother, about long afternoons spent learning the names of 100 different herbs, about the particular way her mother's hands had moved when she worked, sure and gentle all at once, about the years since her passing that had left the inn feeling perpetually understaffed and Mara perpetually exhausted in a way sleep never quite fixed. Lucian, in turn, told her, haltingly at first, the words coming like something long and used, about a childhood spent being carefully deliberately shaped for a throne he had never once been asked whether he wanted. Every decision made for him before he was old enough to understand what was being decided. Who he would eventually marry, chosen for political advantage before he'd learned to properly hold a sword. Who he was permitted to trust, and who he was taught, from his earliest memories, to view with careful suspicion. What he was allowed to believe about the world, and what beliefs were quietly, systematically discouraged in a boy destined to rule. "You sound lonely," Mara said one evening, watching the firelight flicker across his face. "I was never allowed to be lonely," he answered, his voice carrying something old and tired beneath the words. "There is a considerable difference." "That's not the same thing at all," she said softly. He looked into the fire for a long, quiet moment. "No," he admitted finally. "It isn't." That night, Mara brought him tea in a chipped ceramic cup, the same one she'd been using since her mother's passing. He stared down at it for a moment, longer than the gesture seemed to warrant. "You remembered," he said. "You take honey, no milk. I never told you that." "You did," Mara said, allowing herself a small smile. "Yesterday, while you were half asleep by the fire and didn't realize you were talking at all." His eyes sharpened with sudden, genuine interest. "What else did I say?" "Nothing particularly useful." "Tell me anyway." "No," she said, laughing despite herself. His eyes narrowed, though there was nothing hostile in it now, only something curious and warm that hadn't been there 3 days earlier. And then, for the first time in what she suspected had been years, Lucian laughed freely, a real, unguarded sound, without the shadow of the crown pressing down over every word he spoke. Neither of them noticed the soft creak of footsteps pausing just outside the door. Neither of them noticed the faint shift of a shadow beneath the window, listening in the dark, memorizing everything it heard. Someone had already found exactly where the Alpha King was hiding, and they had known for longer than either Mara or Lucian could have imagined. On the 4th night, Lucian woke before Mara, every sense in his body suddenly and violently alert. Something in the air was wrong, not the smell of danger from outside the inn walls, but from somewhere within them. He moved downstairs in absolute silence and found Mara standing frozen behind the bar, a shattered glass at her feet, her face drained of every trace of color. Seated calmly at the counter, as though he had every right in the world to be there, was Captain Dorian, and when his eyes lifted and met Lucian's across the room, he smiled with unmistakable satisfaction. "Your Majesty," he said, the title dripping with quiet menace. The glass Mara had been holding a moment before slipped entirely from her nerveless fingers and shattered again against the floor. Silence stretched through the room, thick and suffocating. "You're the Alpha King?" Mara finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed on Lucian with something between disbelief and betrayal already forming behind them. Lucian said nothing. He didn't need to. Dorian answered for him, savoring every syllable as though he'd been waiting days for the opportunity. "King Lucian Vale, ruler of the Northern Territories, sovereign of every wolf who has ever bent the knee beneath the full moon." The room seemed to tilt beneath Mara's feet. The man she had bandaged with her own hands. The man she had argued with over cups of tea and half-remembered confessions whispered while half asleep. The man she had spent 3 days coming to care for, against every warning instinct she possessed, was the single most powerful werewolf in the entire Northern Territories, and he had let her believe otherwise for 3 entire days. Lucian stepped deliberately between her and Dorian. "Mara, go upstairs. Now." She didn't move an inch. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you safe," he said, not turning to look at her, his eyes fixed entirely on Dorian. "You lied to me." "Yes." That single, unflinching word landed harder than anything else he could have said. Dorian's blade slid free of its sheath with a soft, deliberate hiss that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Enough sentiment for one evening. Lucian shifted, the transformation rippling through his entire body in a heartbeat, his shoulders broadening, his eyes igniting with a brighter, more dangerous gold, his teeth sharpening beneath a low, warning growl that Mara felt more than heard, vibrating through the floorboards beneath her feet. She stumbled backward instinctively, her heart pounding. "Now we finally see the monster," Dorian said, almost pleased. Lucian's growl deepened into something that no longer resembled a human voice at all. "No," he said, "you see the king." Then the windows exploded inward in a shower of glass, and armed men poured through the shattered frames. And Mara's scream was swallowed whole by the sudden chaos as Lucian seized her hand in his. "Stay behind me," he commanded. And this time, Mara didn't argue at all. The fight that followed lasted less than a minute, though it felt, to Mara, like it stretched across an entire lifetime. Lucian moved with a speed and precision that no ordinary man should have possessed, sending one soldier crashing bodily across the room and into an overturned table, disarming another before the man could even fully raise his weapon. Dorian, seeing the tide turn immediately against him, fled through the back door into the darkness, and somewhere behind him, flames had already begun licking hungrily up the old curtains, catching fast against wood that had stood dry and waiting for decades. "Come," Lucian said, pulling her toward the front entrance with an urgency that left no room for hesitation. "Where?" Mara gasped, stumbling after him. "Anywhere but here." They ran together into the darkness of the surrounding trees, and behind them, the inn that had been Mara's entire world for as long as she could remember began to burn in earnest, orange lights spilling across the tree line, smoke rising thick and black against the pale early sky. Mara looked back once, just once, and watched her entire life collapsing into embers and ash behind her. She stopped running. "My mother's things," she whispered. Lucian turned back toward her, his expression torn between urgency and something gentler. "We can't go back for them." "My mother's things," she said again, louder this time, her voice cracking, as though repeating it might somehow undo what was happening. "I know," he said softly, coming toward her. She shoved him away with both hands, anger finally cutting through the shock that had held her frozen since Dorian's smile in the bar. "You lied to me. For 3 days, you let me believe you were nothing more than an injured stranger." "I did. You used me." "No," he said, his voice firm despite everything. "You knew who you were the entire time. You knew men would eventually come looking. You knew this would happen, and you stayed in my home anyway." "Yes," he admitted, meeting her eyes without flinching. "Because you were the first person in 20 years who looked at me and saw a wounded man instead of a crown to be used, a bloodline to be protected, an alliance to be arranged." Mara's anger faltered, just slightly, though she refused to let it show. "You gave me food before you even knew my name," he continued, his voice low and steady. "You treated my wound when you believed I was nothing more than a stranger bleeding out beneath a tree. You hid me from armed soldiers in your own home when every reasonable instinct you possessed should have told you to save yourself instead and let me be found." His golden eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch despite herself. "I did not stay because you were useful to me, Mara. I stayed because for the first time and longer than I can properly remember, you reminded me what it felt like to simply be human." Mara looked away, blinking hard against the sudden burn of tears she refused to let fall. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this." "You don't have to," he said quietly. A distant howl rose through the trees, long and mournful, echoing off the mountains in the far distance. Lucian's head turned sharply toward the sound, every muscle in his body suddenly tense. "They're coming," he said. "Who?" Mara asked, dread pooling cold in her stomach. His jaw tightened visibly. "My brother." They reached the crumbling ruins of an abandoned chapel just before dawn, its roof half collapsed under decades of neglect, ivy climbing thick through cracks in the ancient stone walls. Lucian built a small, careful fire in the shelter of what remained of the altar, and Mara sat across from him on the cold floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, watching him with an exhaustion that reached far deeper than her aching body. "Your own brother try to have you killed?" she asked finally, breaking the long silence between them. "Yes. Why would he do that? He wants the crown for himself. Then why hasn't he simply taken it, if he's willing to go this far already?" "Because the wolves would never truly follow him," Lucian said, his gaze distant. "Not the way they follow me." Mara frowned, confused. "Why not?" Lucian met her eyes, and something in his expression made her stomach twist with sudden dread before he had even spoken a single word. "Because an alpha's bond to his mate is woven into what holds the entire pack together. It is not merely tradition. It is something older than that, something the wolves feel in their very blood." Mara's heart skipped painfully in her chest. "What does any of that have to do with me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the small fire and took her wrist gently in his hand, turning it over to catch the firelight. A faint silver crescent had appeared on her skin, delicate and pale, like something drawn there by frost. "When did that happen?" Mara breathed, staring down at the mark as though it might vanish if she looked away. "The night you first pressed your hand against my wound," he said quietly. "What does it mean, Lucian?" His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, careful and deliberate, as though the words themselves carried weight he didn't want to rush. "It means the moon has chosen you." Silence pressed in around them, broken only by the crackle of the small fire, and, somewhere in the far distance, another rising howl. "This is impossible," Mara said, pulling her hand back sharply. "I know. You expect me to simply believe something like that." "No," he said, his golden eyes steady on hers. "I expect nothing from you at all." That answer, more than anything else he could have said in that moment, undid something in her chest that she hadn't realized was still holding firm. He wasn't demanding she accept any of this. He wasn't claiming her the way she imagined a king might claim anything he decided he wanted. He was simply offering her the truth, plainly and without pressure, and then waiting to see what she would do with it. After a long silence, Mara finally asked, "What happens if I refuse it?" "You remain entirely free," Lucian said. "No obligación, no expectación. And you?" "I remain king." "Alone?" "Most likely, yes." She studied his face carefully across the fire. "You are truly terrible at this." "I have had remarkably little practice," he admitted, and despite the fire, the betrayal, the impossible silver mark now burned permanently into her skin, Mara found herself laughing. A real, unguarded laugh that surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. And for the first time since watching her entire home collapse into ash and smoke behind her, the fear lodged deep in her chest made room, however small, for something else entirely. Hope. They remained together in the shelter of the ruined chapel until nightfall settled fully over the surrounding woods, when the sudden, sharp sound of snapping branch outside brought Lucian instantly to his feet, every trace of the earlier warmth between them gone in an instant. "Someone is coming," he said. Mara reached instinctively for his hand. "Your brother?" "No," Lucian said, his voice low and tense. "This is something else." The heavy chapel doors swung open, and Mara's breath caught painfully in her throat. Captain Dorian stood framed in the entrance, and behind him stretched a long line of at least 20 armed soldiers, their weapons catching what little moonlight filtered through the broken roof. And there, standing among them, unmistakably and impossibly, stood Elise, Mara's closest friend since childhood, the woman who had shared every secret Mara had ever carefully kept. "Elise," Mara whispered, disbelief washing cold through her entire body. Elise wouldn't meet her eyes. Lucian understood the truth of it before Mara's mind had even fully caught up to what she was seeing. She led them here. "No," Mara breathed, shaking her head. "No, she wouldn't do that. Not to me." Elise finally lifted her gaze, tears already spilling freely down her face. "I'm so sorry, Mara." "Why?" Mara demanded, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this to me?" "They have my daughter," Elise choked out, her whole body trembling. "They told me nothing would happen to you, if I only told them where to find you. They promised, Mara. I swear to you they promised." Everything inside Mara's chest went suddenly, terribly cold. She lowered the small weapon she hadn't even fully realized she had picked up. Dorian stepped forward, his sword catching the dying firelight from within the chapel. "Come quietly, Your Majesty, and no further harm needs to come to anyone here tonight." Lucian's gaze flicked briefly to Mara before returning, hard and unyielding, to Dorian. "Run," he told her. "No, Mara, I am not leaving you here. You have to." Dorian raised his blade higher, his patience visibly thinning. "Then you will both die in this chapel tonight." Lucian began to shift, power rippling visibly through his frame. But before the transformation could fully take hold, Mara stepped deliberately between him and every soldier gathered in the doorway. The entire room froze at once. She looked directly at Dorian, her voice steadier than she felt. "Take me instead." "Mara, no," Lucian said, reaching for her arm. She turned back just long enough to catch his eyes and whispered, "Trust me," before stepping forward and surrendering herself into the hands of men who fully intended to use her as a weapon against the person she had somehow, impossibly, over the course of only a handful of days, come to love. They brought her to the royal fortress under heavy guard, and Lucian was forced to watch, utterly powerless, from the safety of the distant tree line as the massive gates closed behind her. The first time since claiming his throne that he had felt entirely, helplessly unable to protect something that mattered to him. Inside the fortress, Mara was locked into a bare stone chamber with nothing but a narrow slit of a window high above her reach. And it was there, hours later, that Dorian finally came to see her, his usual composure cracking faintly at the edges for the first time since she'd known him. "You made this considerably more difficult than it ever needed to be," he said, standing just inside the doorway. "Where is Lucian?" "Coming for you, I expect. He was always predictably devoted to the things he claims as his own." Mara allowed herself a small, humorless smile despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. "You sound almost afraid of him, Captain. You do not understand what he truly is," Dorian said, his voice tightening. "No," Mara said, holding his gaze steadily without flinching. "I understand exactly what he is." She thought of the wounded man she had found bleeding beneath the ancient oak, a man who had refused, even while dying, to ask for the help he so clearly needed. She thought of the stranger who had somehow remembered, without ever being told twice, exactly how she liked her tea prepared. She thought of the king who had given her a genuine choice in that ruined chapel, when he could so easily have claimed her as his own and left her no say in the matter at all. He is a man who has been betrayed by nearly everyone he has ever placed his trust in, Mara said quietly, her voice steady despite everything. "And that, Captain, is precisely why you're going to lose." Dorian said nothing in response, though something uncertain flickered briefly across his expression before he turned sharply and left her alone in the darkness of the stone chamber. That night, long after the last of the fortress torches had guttered low, the great bells above the fortress began to ring. Once, then twice, then a third time, the sound echoing endlessly off the surrounding stone walls until confused guards scrambled toward the main gates in the darkness. Mara pressed herself against the narrow window slit and heard a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the fortress beneath her feet, a sound so raw and powerful that she felt it in her bones more than she heard it with her ears. She knew, with absolute and unwavering certainty, exactly what it meant. Lucian had come for her. The main gates burst violently inward in an explosion of splintered wood and broken stone. Wolves flooded into the courtyard below in overwhelming numbers, and soldiers scattered in every direction as Lucian walked calmly through the drifting smoke at the center of it all. Not running, not rushing forward in a frenzy, because he no longer had any need to. Every single creature standing in that courtyard, wolf and human alike, understood immediately and instinctively exactly who had returned to reclaim what belonged to him. Dorian met him at the center of the courtyard, sword already drawn. You cannot possibly win this. Lucian's gaze never wavered from his face. I already have. Their blades met in a clash of ringing steel that echoed across the entire fortress, and from her narrow window high above, Mara watched with her heart lodged firmly in her throat. Lucian fought differently than she had somehow imagined he would. Not as a man driven purely by vengeance, but as a king fighting with everything he had left to protect the one thing he refused to lose. Then a second figure emerged slowly from the shadows near the shattered gate, and Mara felt the silver mark on her wrist begin to burn with sudden, unmistakable heat. The resemblance between the two men was impossible to miss even from a distance. "Brother," the newcomer said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, and Lucian went utterly rigid at the sound of it. "You," Lucian growled, low and dangerous. The man's eyes drifted upward, finding Mara's window with unsettling precision, and something cold and deeply satisfied crossed his face. And the mate at last, Adrian, Lucian's own blood, his own brother, smiled as though everything unfolding before him in that courtyard was proceeding exactly according to some carefully laid plan. Because it was. He had never once truly wanted the crown for its own sake. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was the bond itself. If Lucian rejected his mate outright, the entire pack would weaken from within, its foundation cracked beyond repair. And if Lucian accepted her instead, as he clearly already had, Adrian could use that very bond as a weapon turned directly against him. Every single piece of it had been arranged from the very beginning. The ambush deep in the woods, the deliberate use of a silver blade, Dorian's carefully cultivated betrayal, even the desperate, coerced confession that had led an army of soldiers straight to the door of a crumbling chapel. But Adrian, for all his careful planning, had made one critical and ultimately fatal miscalculation. He had entirely underestimated the quiet strength of a woman the rest of the kingdom had spent her whole life overlooking. From her position high in the tower, Mara scanned the room around her with sudden, sharp focus. The old, weathered ropes once used to haul heavy supplies up from the courtyard below, the ancient mechanism connected directly to the great fortress bell, the row of oil lamps lining the stone wall beside her. And she remembered, with sudden clarity, something her mother had told her years and years before, long before any of this had ever seemed possible. When fear takes hold of you completely, don't waste your strength asking what you're capable of fighting. Ask instead what you're capable of changing. Mara seized the heavy rope in both hands and pulled with everything her body had left to give. The great bell rang out across the entire fortress. Once, twice, A third time, the sound rolling like thunder across the stone walls, and every single wolf standing in that courtyard stopped completely still, as though frozen in place by the sound alone. Lucian looked up sharply. Mara stood framed in the tower window high above them all, her marked wrist raised high into the night air, and one by one, every wolf gathered below lowered themselves slowly to the ground in unmistakable submission. Adrian's confident, satisfied smile finally, visibly broke. The moon had chosen, and there was nothing left for him to do about it. Not because Mara possessed some hidden power she had never before revealed, but because she had proven again and again, across every single moment since that first cry had reached her beneath the ancient oak, that true courage was never the simple absence of fear. It was, and had always been, the deliberate decision to act anyway, while afraid, when every instinct screamed at you to run in the opposite direction instead. Adrian lunged forward at Lucian with sudden, renewed fury, and the two brothers fought beneath the pale moonlight that had chosen one of them and rejected the other entirely. One man hungry for a power he had never once earned through anything but betrayal, the other fighting simply to protect the fragile, unexpected freedom he had only just begun, over these past few impossible days, to properly understand. Mara didn't remain safely hidden in the tower. She descended the narrow stone stairs two at a time, striking a startled Dorian across the head with a heavy iron lantern hard enough to drop him instantly where he stood, and ran full speed toward the courtyard, just as Adrian raised his sword high, aiming directly for her. "Mara!" Lucian's voice tore raw and desperate through the chaos of the courtyard. She froze half a second too long, her feet refusing to move. Lucian threw himself bodily between her and the descending blade, and the cold steel found him instead, sinking deep. Mara screamed as he collapsed hard against the stone ground, blood already spreading rapidly beneath him. Exactly as it had that very first night, she had found him bleeding beneath the ancient oak tree, as though the entire story had somehow circled back to its own beginning. But this time, Mara was not afraid. She dropped instantly to her knees beside him and pressed her palm firmly against the wound, and the silver mark on her wrist blazed suddenly with brilliant light. Beneath her trembling hand, the torn flesh began, impossibly and unmistakably, to close itself. Adrian stared, disbelief written plainly across his face. "No." Lucian rose slowly, unsteadily, to his feet, growing visibly stronger with every single breath he took. "You forgot something important, brother." "What?" Adrian demanded, already backing away toward the shattered gate. Lucian turned to look directly at Mara, something fierce and unwavering settling permanently over his entire expression. "I'm not alone anymore." The wolves howled together as one single, unified voice that shook the very stones of the fortress. Adrian's sword slipped from his suddenly nerveless grip and struck the ground with a sound that echoed long and hollow through the ruined courtyard, and the battle, at long last, after everything, was finally completely over. Weeks later, the village of Blackridge began slowly, carefully to rebuild itself. The old inn was entirely gone, reduced to nothing but ash and cold memory, and Mara mourned its loss quietly, privately, in the small hours when sleep refused to come. It had been the very last piece of her mother that remained anywhere in the world. But Lucian never once told her to simply set the loss aside and move forward as though it hadn't mattered. Instead, he gave her something entirely new to build toward. A fresh inn constructed on that very same familiar plot of land, incorporating the same worn oak table salvaged carefully from the wreckage, the same stone fireplace, painstakingly rebuilt stone by stone exactly as it had once stood, and a newly carved wooden sign hung proudly above the front door that read, simply, the OAKN Moon. Mara stood staring up at it for a long moment, something tightening unexpectedly in her throat. "You named it." "I did," Lucian said. "Why that particular name?" "Because that is where I first found you," he said simply. She shook her head slowly, smiling despite the sudden tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "No, that is where I found you." Lucian laughed, low and genuinely warm. "Fair enough, then. Perhaps the name suits us both equally." He reached for her hand, and the silver crescent mark on her wrist, now faded permanently into something softer, something almost gentle beneath her skin, seemed to catch the afternoon light. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked quietly. "Finding you that night beneath the oak? Saving me, you mean," he corrected gently. "Any of it, truly." He considered the question with the same careful seriousness he now brought to nearly everything. "No," he said finally, without a trace of hesitation. "Not for a single moment of it. Even though your entire life changed irreversibly because of that one choice. Especially because it changed," he said. "I would not trade a single day of it, not even the worst of them." She leaned gently against his shoulder, watching the last warm light of the afternoon settle slowly over the rebuilt village around them. "Do you ever find yourself missing being entirely on your own?" His gaze drifted toward the distant tree line, toward the very same forest that had once nearly cost him everything he had. "Sometimes," he admitted honestly. She raised an eyebrow at him, waiting. "But I never once miss being lonely," he added quietly. And Mara finally, fully understood the exact difference between the two, a difference she suspected would stay with her for the rest of her life. A full year to the very day after that first desperate cry had first echoed through the trees and reached her ears, Mara found herself standing once again beneath the same ancient oak. The village around her had grown considerably in the time since. More houses now lined the familiar paths. More travelers passed steadily through on their way to distant places. More children ran laughing and shrieking through streets that had once, not so very long ago, felt almost unbearably quiet and still. The forest itself hadn't changed at all, not truly, but the people of Blackridge no longer feared its shadows the way they once had for as long as anyone could remember. She rested her open palm gently against the familiar bark of the great oak, remembering, in vivid and unwelcome detail, the blood that had once soaked the ground here, the fear that had gripped her chest so tightly she could barely breathe, the desperate, broken cry of a stranger who had told her, again and again with his very last conscious breath, simply to run. Lucian found her there eventually, as he so often did these days, drawn instinctively to wherever she happened to be. "You disappeared again," he said gently. "I came here to remember." "Remember what, exactly?" "The woman I used to be, before that particular night, changed everything." He stood quietly beside her for a long moment. "Do you miss her at all?" "Sometimes," Mara admitted, echoing his own earlier words back to him with a small, knowing smile. "What changed for you in the end?" She turned to face him fully, studying his familiar features in the fading afternoon light. "I learned, eventually, that choosing kindness was never the same thing as being weak." He nodded slowly, considering this. "And I learned, in turn, that true strength was never about refusing to need anyone else at all." He reached for her hand, and together they walked slowly back toward the village they had rebuilt from nothing but ash and stubborn hope, the forest whispering behind them in the cooling evening wind. No longer anything to be feared, only something quiet and steady to be remembered. Some people arrive in our lives already falling apart at the seams. Sometimes they arrive wounded, bleeding, barely holding themselves together. Sometimes they arrive carrying an anger they themselves don't fully understand. Sometimes they arrive holding secrets far too heavy to name aloud, even to themselves. And sometimes, like Lucian, they arrive having convinced themselves, deep in their bones, that accepting help from another person is the deepest weakness a man can show the world. But Mara taught him something different, something he had long ago forgotten, if he had ever truly known it at all. She taught him that real strength was never about standing entirely alone against the world. Sometimes she showed him the bravest and most difficult thing a person could ever do was simply allow someone else to stand quietly beside them, without pretending they didn't need it. And in turn, Mara learned something just as important from him. That true kindness should never once require surrendering your own careful judgment along with it. She had not saved Lucian that first night because he happened to wear a crown she knew nothing about. She saved him because he was hurting, in pain, and that alone had been reason enough for her. And when the full truth of exactly who he was finally came to light in that firelit inn, she did not simply follow him blindly into whatever came next. She questioned him. She challenged him openly. She demanded honesty from him before she was willing to offer even the smallest piece of her trust in return. And she only truly chose to remain by his side once he had given her the complete and genuine freedom to walk away from him entirely, without consequence, without obligation. That, perhaps, more than anything else in their entire story, is the true and lasting difference between love and mere possession. Possession says, simply and coldly, "You belong to me now," and leaves no real room for choice at all. Love says something entirely different. Love says, you're free to leave whenever you truly wish to. And still, even knowing that, I will hope with everything I have that you choose to stay by my side anyway. Perhaps that is exactly why their story, out of so many others, endured the way it did. Not because some distant, uncaring fate simply forced two people together against their own will and better judgment, but because when fate finally did open a door between them, however unexpectedly, both of them, entirely of their own free will, chose to walk through it together. So if there's only one single thing worth carrying with you from the story of Mara and Lucian tonight, let it be simply this. Never, under any circumstances, underestimate the quiet, unassuming power of someone who chooses kindness even when absolutely no one else is watching. A single small act of genuine compassion has the power to alter the entire course of a person's life. One moment of quiet, unglamorous courage can save an entire family from ruin. And sometimes, just sometimes, one person's simple, stubborn refusal to walk away from someone else's pain can end up changing the fate of an entire kingdom. And if Mara had somehow been standing beneath that very same ancient oak tree again, knowing then everything she knows now, every risk she would eventually take, every loss she would eventually suffer, every impossible truth waiting patiently for her out there in the dark, she would still, without a single moment of hesitation, have heard that same desperate cry echoing through the trees. She would still have stopped walking. She would still, every single time, have turned toward the darkness instead of quietly turning away from it. Because somewhere along the way, through everything that followed, she had learned something that no crown, no ancient prophecy, and no bond between wolf and moon could ever have properly taught her on its own. Sometimes, the single greatest turning point of your entire life begins with nothing more than one simple, quiet choice to help someone who has absolutely no way in the world of ever helping you back. If this story stayed with you tonight, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We genuinely love hearing from all of you. And if you're new here, don't forget to click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.